The most expensive lie in that courtroom was not worth $1 billion. It was worth a marriage. The statement echoed through Department 14 of the Manhattan Family Court on a gray October morning as more than 100 spectators leaned forward in silence. Outside, rain streaked across the courthouse windows, turning the skyline into a watercolor of steel and glass. Inside, every eye was fixed on Ethan Whitmore. At 42, Ethan was the kind of billionaire business magazines loved to place on their covers. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly. His silver watch cost more than most people's annual salary. His confidence filled the room long before his voice did. Across from him sat Naomi Brooks Whitmore. She wore no designer labels anyone could easily recognize. No diamonds sparkled on her hands. The wedding ring she had worn for 11 years was gone, leaving only a faint pale mark against her deep brown skin. She sat quietly beside her attorney, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. If anyone had walked into the courtroom without knowing their story, they might have assumed she was merely another forgotten spouse standing in the shadow of a powerful man. Ethan certainly seemed to believe that. Judge Rebecca Lawson adjusted her glasses and reviewed the documents before her. The room remained still enough to hear pages turning. Then Ethan's attorney stood and delivered the statement that would change everything. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore is requesting a settlement completely disproportionate to her actual contribution. The truth is simple. During the marriage, Mr. Whitmore built Whitmore Capital. Mrs. Whitmore never worked a single day for the company. A murmur swept through the gallery. Several reporters immediately began typing notes. Ethan remained calm, almost relaxed. He had heard this argument many times during preparation. He believed it. Perhaps after enough years, he had even convinced himself it was true. Judge Lawson looked toward Naomi. Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to respond? Naomi slowly lifted her eyes. The courtroom expected anger. Maybe tears. Maybe outrage. Instead, she offered a small, almost gentle smile. No, Your Honor. The answer surprised everyone. Even Ethan frowned. No, the judge asked. Not today, Naomi said softly. The calm certainty in her voice lingered in the room long after the words ended. Judge Lawson studied her for a moment before nodding. Very well. The proceedings continued. Financial records were introduced. Company valuations were discussed. Numbers climbed into the hundreds of millions. Yet Naomi remained silent. Then, nearly an hour later, her attorney stood. Your Honor, before we continue, I would like to submit Exhibit A. A single worn document was placed before the judge. The paper looked old enough to have been forgotten by time itself. Judge Lawson lowered her eyes toward the signature at the bottom of the page. Her expression changed. For the first time that morning, she stopped turning pages. And across the room, Naomi's quiet smile returned. Judge Rebecca Lawson kept her eyes on the faded document for several long seconds. The courtroom that had been buzzing with confidence only moments earlier suddenly felt smaller, quieter. The signature at the bottom of the page was clear and unmistakable. Naomi Brooks. Not Naomi Whitmore. Naomi Brooks. The name she had carried before the wealth, before the magazine covers, before the billion-dollar headquarters overlooking the Hudson River. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. It was the first visible sign of discomfort he had shown all morning. Across the aisle, Naomi remained composed. The rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows as her attorney approached the bench. Your Honor, he said, that document is the original business proposal submitted to secure the company's first $75,000 startup loan 11 years ago. Judge Lawson examined the date. The paper had been filed long before Whitmore Capital became a household name. Long before investors competed for meetings with Ethan Whitmore. Long before private jets, luxury conferences, and televised interviews. The judge looked up. And this signature belongs to Mrs. Whitmore? Yes, Your Honor, the attorney replied. At the time, she was Naomi Brooks. Ethan immediately leaned toward his legal team. Quiet. Whispers passed between them. Something about the document clearly surprised them. Yet Naomi was not surprised. She remembered the night that paper had been created. 11 years earlier, she had been sitting at a small kitchen table in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. The apartment measured barely 600 square feet. The radiator rattled every winter. The ceiling leaked whenever heavy rain rolled through the city. But inside that tiny space lived a dream much larger than its walls. Ethan was 29 then. Brilliant, ambitious, restless. He owned a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner and enough determination to power an entire city. Most people saw a struggling financial analyst with unrealistic ambitions. Naomi saw something different. She saw possibility. Every evening after work, they would spread documents across the kitchen table. Market reports, industry forecasts, investor lists. Coffee cups often remained untouched until midnight because both of them became so absorbed in planning their future. Ethan would pace the room, describing his vision. Naomi would sit quietly, asking questions nobody else thought to ask. Questions about risk, about scalability, about sustainability. Questions that transformed ideas into strategy. When Ethan became discouraged after rejection emails arrived, Naomi stayed up with him. When potential investors declined meetings, Naomi reorganized presentations and rebuilt projections. She never asked for recognition. She believed they were building something together. Back then, there had been no cameras, no headlines, no applause. Only two people chasing one impossible dream beneath the glow of a single kitchen light. And somewhere inside the courtroom, as another old document was carefully removed from a worn storage box, the past was preparing to speak again. The second document placed before Judge Lawson looked even older than the first. Its edges were worn, its corners softened by time. Yet the signature at the bottom remained sharp and clear. Naomi Brooks. The judge carefully compared it to the previous exhibit. Identical. Across the courtroom, reporters exchanged curious glances. What had begun as a routine divorce proceeding was slowly becoming something else. Naomi watched quietly as memories surfaced one after another. In those early years, Whitmore Capital existed only inside notebooks, spreadsheets, and late-night conversations. The company had no executive floor, no conference center, no staff of hundreds. It operated from a borrowed desk inside a shared office building where the monthly rent was less than $1,000. Ethan often received the praise. He was charismatic, confident, easy for investors to remember. Naomi preferred the background. She believed results mattered more than recognition. While Ethan attended networking events across Manhattan, Naomi built systems. She created budgeting models. She analyzed market trends. She organized investor databases containing thousands of contacts. Every Sunday afternoon, she sat for hours reviewing reports and correcting projections. Sometimes she worked until 2 o'clock in the morning before waking again at 6. Yet she never considered it sacrifice. She considered it partnership. The judge turned another page. This document was different. It contained handwritten notes in the margins. Arrows connected sections. Entire paragraphs had been revised in blue ink. Judge Lawson adjusted her glasses and looked closer. "Whose handwriting is this?" she asked. Naomi's attorney answered immediately. "Mrs. Whitmore's, Your Honor." The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. 11 years earlier, Whitmore Capital had faced its first major crisis. An investor withdrew support just 48 hours before a critical funding deadline. Ethan had been devastated. Months of effort seemed ready to collapse. Naomi remembered finding him alone in their tiny office, staring out a window overlooking a parking lot. For the first time, he had spoken about giving up. She remembered placing a cup of coffee beside him and opening her laptop. Then she worked for nearly 30 straight hours. She rewrote the presentation, restructured the financial forecast, identified a new target group of investors. By the following week, the company secured enough capital to survive. That funding became the foundation for everything that followed. Yet when the deal closed, only Ethan's name appeared in the press release. Naomi never complained. She simply moved on to the next challenge. Success arrived one milestone at a time. A larger office, more employees, bigger clients. Every achievement carried traces of her work. Every breakthrough contained pieces of her thinking. And as another storage box was opened near the judge's bench, revealing dozens more forgotten records, a growing realization began spreading through the courtroom. Naomi's signature was not appearing occasionally. It was appearing everywhere. Success arrived quietly at first. A second office opened in Midtown. Then a third. New employees filled desks that had once existed only in Ethan and Naomi's imagination. Investors who had ignored their emails now competed for meetings. Financial publications began mentioning Whitmore Capital as one of the fastest-growing firms in New York. The future they had built together seemed brighter than ever. Yet success has a strange way of changing what people remember. Back in the courtroom, another document was projected onto a large screen. The audience watched as a strategic expansion plan appeared. Across dozens of pages were detailed notes, financial assumptions, and implementation timelines. Judge Lawson examined the final page. Once again, Naomi's signature rested at the bottom. Calm, consistent, present. 11 years earlier, those same pages had occupied countless evenings in a small conference room overlooking Lexington Avenue. The company was preparing for its most ambitious expansion. Competitors were larger, better funded, more established. One mistake could have ended everything. Ethan spent his days pitching investors and appearing at industry events. Naomi remained behind the scenes, studying numbers, identifying weaknesses, and building systems capable of supporting growth. She developed hiring frameworks, operational procedures, risk assessments. Many of the policies Whitmore Capital still used years later had originated from notebooks she kept in a locked desk drawer. Yet as revenue increased, so did public attention. Reporters wanted interviews. Business networks requested appearances. Magazine photographers arrived. And almost every time, the cameras pointed toward Ethan. He was articulate, charismatic, easy to market as a self-made visionary. Naomi rarely attended those events. She preferred solving problems rather than discussing them. At first, Ethan always acknowledged her contributions. During interviews, he spoke about their partnership. During speeches, he thanked her. During celebrations, he made certain everyone knew how much she had done. But slowly, almost invisibly, those mentions became less frequent. One article referred to him as a lone genius. Another described him as the sole architect of the company's success. Then came television appearances where hosts introduced him as the man who built everything from scratch. The corrections stopped. Naomi noticed it. Of course she did. Yet every time she considered saying something, another challenge appeared. Another acquisition. Another expansion. Another crisis requiring attention. She convinced herself that recognition did not matter. The work mattered. The mission mattered. Their marriage mattered. Looking back, she would later realize that history was already being rewritten. Not in a dramatic moment. Not through a single decision. But through 1,000 small omissions. In the courtroom, Judge Lawson turned another page and discovered more handwritten notes. More planning documents. More evidence of a presence hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, across the aisle, Ethan stared at the growing stack of exhibits with an expression that had begun to lose its certainty. And for the first time that day, the billionaire who once commanded every room no longer looked like the most powerful person in the courtroom. The transformation did not happen overnight. That was the dangerous part. There was no single morning when Ethan woke up and decided to erase Naomi from the story. Instead, success arrived in layers, and with every new layer, the distance between perception and reality grew wider. 5 years after Whitmore Capital launched, the company occupied 3 full floors in a glass tower overlooking Park Avenue. Industry leaders sought Ethan's opinion. Universities invited him to speak. Investors described him as visionary. The word appeared so often that eventually it followed him everywhere. At first, Naomi celebrated every achievement beside him. She attended charity galas, corporate dinners, and award ceremonies. She smiled for photographs she never wanted to take. She listened as hosts introduced Ethan as the mastermind behind the company's meteoric rise. More than once she expected him to correct them. Sometimes he did. Most times he did not. Back in the courtroom, another exhibit appeared on the large screen. This one was an internal memorandum outlining a major acquisition that had doubled the company's value almost overnight. Judge Lawson carefully reviewed the document. Once again, the strategy notes carried Naomi's handwriting. Once again, her signature rested at the bottom. Ethan's jaw tightened. His attorneys whispered urgently among themselves. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Years earlier, Naomi had spent 6 months researching that acquisition. She had traveled, analyzed competitors, reviewed financial records, and identified opportunities others overlooked. When she finally presented her findings, several executives initially dismissed the proposal as too risky. Ethan had supported it. At the time, they still functioned as a team. The acquisition became one of the most profitable decisions in company history. Yet months later, during a nationally televised interview, the host praised Ethan's bold leadership and brilliant vision. Naomi remembered watching from their penthouse living room. The city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. She waited for him to mention the countless hours they had spent developing the strategy together. The acknowledgement never came. She told herself it was not important. The company was thriving. Their future appeared secure. But omissions have consequences. A name removed from one article becomes absent from 10, then 50, then hundreds. Over time, people stopped asking what Naomi did. They simply assumed she did nothing. The lie was never spoken directly. It merely grew in the empty space where truth should have been. Judge Lawson leaned back in her chair and studied the mounting evidence. Each document revealed the same story. Not a spouse standing beside success. A partner helping create it. And as another storage box was carried toward the bench, containing records no one had examined in years, a quiet tension settled across the courtroom. Somewhere inside those forgotten files waited a revelation even Ethan himself was not prepared to face. The first time Naomi heard the name Victoria Hale, it seemed insignificant. Whitmore Capital had grown into a company employing hundreds of people across multiple states. New executives arrived every year. New departments formed. New faces appeared in boardrooms and annual reports. Victoria was introduced as the company's new head of public relations, a woman with an impressive resume and an instinct for building powerful brands. At first, Naomi welcomed her. Victoria was polished, intelligent, and remarkably skilled at shaping public perception. Within months, media coverage of Whitmore Capital increased dramatically. Ethan appeared on more magazine covers. Television interviews multiplied. Industry awards followed. The company had never looked stronger. Yet beneath the polished headlines, something subtle began to change. Victoria understood the power of storytelling. More importantly, she understood that simple stories sold better than complicated truths. Investors preferred a single visionary founder. Journalists preferred a lone genius overcoming impossible odds. Audiences loved heroes. Partnerships were harder to explain. During one strategy meeting, Naomi quietly suggested highlighting the broader leadership team. Victoria smiled politely before dismissing the idea. She explained that consistency was essential for brand recognition. Ethan represented the company. The company represented Ethan. The formula was working. Nobody argued. Over time, Victoria became one of Ethan's closest advisors. She traveled with him to conferences, prepared his interviews, managed his public appearances. Whenever a reporter asked about the company's success, Victoria already had the narrative prepared. The brilliant entrepreneur, the relentless builder, the self-made billionaire. Naomi noticed that her own role continued shrinking inside that story. Years of contributions became brief mentions. Brief mentions became footnotes. Footnotes disappeared entirely. Back in the courtroom, another exhibit appeared on the screen. This one was not a financial report or acquisition plan. It was a marketing presentation prepared nearly 6 years earlier. Judge Lawson carefully examined the opening slides. They outlined a complete public relations strategy designed to position Ethan as the singular face of Whitmore Capital. The judge continued reading. Several sections contained handwritten comments challenging the approach. Those comments belonged to Naomi. She had warned that reducing the company to one individual created long-term risks. Her concerns had been ignored. Ethan stared at the screen. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, memory, regret. He remembered that meeting. He remembered Naomi sitting across the conference table. He remembered choosing the easier story because everyone else said it would accelerate growth. And it had. Revenue increased. Public interest surged. The company expanded faster than ever before. But now, years later, surrounded by boxes filled with forgotten evidence, a painful truth was beginning to emerge. The story that made Ethan famous was not entirely false. It was simply incomplete. And sometimes the most damaging lies are the ones built from pieces of the truth. The document that changed everything was not hidden inside a financial report or acquisition file. It arrived in a simple white folder that looked almost ordinary compared to the mountains of evidence already surrounding Judge Lawson's bench. Yet the moment Naomi's attorney placed it before the court, the atmosphere shifted. Judge Lawson opened the folder and immediately noticed the date. It was from 3 years earlier. By then, Whitmore Capital had become one of the most respected investment firms in the country. Revenue exceeded expectations. New offices operated from Chicago to San Francisco. Ethan's face appeared regularly on business channels. To the outside world, his life looked perfect, but success had begun creating fractures that no financial statement could measure. 3 years earlier, Naomi started noticing how little time she and Ethan spent speaking about anything meaningful. Their conversations revolved around schedules, events, and company obligations. The partnership that once filled long evenings around a kitchen table had been replaced by calendars managed weeks in advance. Whenever Naomi raised concerns, Ethan insisted everything was fine. The company was thriving. Their future was secure. What more could anyone want? Yet Naomi sensed something slipping away. She could feel it in the empty spaces between conversations. She could see it during dinners interrupted by endless phone calls. She could hear it in the growing number of decisions made without her involvement. The folder now sitting before Judge Lawson contained executive restructuring proposals. Naomi remembered them clearly. Several documents outlined changes to leadership responsibilities. Entire divisions she had helped build were reassigned without consultation. Her recommendations appeared crossed out. Her authority steadily reduced. Not through confrontation, through exclusion. The judge slowly turned each page. Every revision carried timestamps. Every draft revealed the same pattern. Naomi's participation diminished while other voices gained influence. Among those voices, one name appeared repeatedly: Victoria Hale. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time that day, he seemed unwilling to look directly at the evidence. He remembered those meetings. He remembered convincing himself that the changes were necessary. Investors wanted clearer leadership structures. Advisors recommended streamlining decision-making. The explanations sounded reasonable at the time. Looking back, they sounded different. Looking back, they sounded like excuses. Naomi never fought for power. That was never who she was. She believed contribution mattered more than titles. But every relationship has a breaking point. Not a dramatic explosion. Not a single argument. Just a moment when one person realizes they are no longer being seen. As Judge Lawson reached the final page, she paused. The document contained a handwritten note in Naomi's unmistakable script. It was brief. Only one sentence. Yet after reading it, the judge remained silent for several seconds. Then she looked directly toward Naomi. And for the first time since the trial began, there was unmistakable sadness in her eyes. The handwritten note at the bottom of the page contained only 9 words. Yet those 9 words carried the weight of an entire marriage. Naomi had written, "I hope success never makes us forget us." Judge Lawson read the sentence twice before setting the document down. The courtroom remained silent. No one needed an explanation. The meaning was painfully clear. Years before lawyers, court filings, and public accusations, Naomi had already sensed the direction their lives were moving. She had seen the warning signs long before anyone else. The distance, the assumptions, the growing belief that achievement belonged to one person instead of two. Back then, she still believed it could be fixed. She still believed Ethan would remember who he had been before the headlines. Ethan stared at the document from across the room. For a moment, the courtroom disappeared. He remembered the evening Naomi wrote that note. It had been after a board meeting that ran nearly 6 hours. Investors were celebrating another record-breaking quarter. Everyone had been congratulating him. By the time he returned home, Naomi was sitting alone on the terrace overlooking Central Park. The city lights reflected across the glass buildings surrounding them. She had asked a simple question. Was he happy? Ethan remembered answering with a discussion about revenue targets and expansion goals. Naomi had smiled sadly and changed the subject. At the time, he never understood why. Looking back now, he realized she had not been asking about business. She had been asking about them. Another exhibit appeared before Judge Lawson. This one was different. It was not connected to company operations. It was a copy of an email Naomi had sent to Ethan nearly 2 years before the divorce filing. The message was short, respectful, honest. In it, she requested that they spend one weekend away from work. No meetings, no investors, no phones, just time. Together. Ethan searched his memory. Then he remembered. He had canceled the trip 3 days later because of an important conference in California. He promised they would reschedule. They never did. Judge Lawson continued reading. More emails followed. More invitations. More attempts. Each one revealed the same pattern. Naomi reaching toward the marriage. Ethan reaching toward the company. Neither choice seemed dramatic at the time. Yet over years, small decisions become permanent distances. Across the gallery, even the reporters had stopped typing. The evidence was no longer about money. It was about something far more human. And as Naomi's attorney opened a thin black folder that had remained untouched throughout the day, Ethan felt a growing unease. Because unlike the business records, he had no idea what was inside. And judging by the expression that crossed Naomi's face, neither did anyone else. Naomi's attorney opened the black folder with unusual care. Unlike the business records stacked throughout the courtroom, this folder contained no contracts, no investor presentations, and no financial forecasts. Judge Lawson accepted the documents and slowly began reviewing them. The first page appeared ordinary, then the second, then the third. Within moments, her expression changed. Across the room, Ethan leaned forward. Whatever was inside had clearly captured the judge's full attention. Several years earlier, as Whitmore Capital expanded into new markets, Naomi had quietly begun documenting major company decisions. Not because she expected a courtroom battle one day, not because she distrusted Ethan. She simply believed important institutional knowledge should be preserved. While executives came and went, records remained. The folder contained meeting summaries, internal recommendations, and leadership assessments spanning nearly a decade. What made them remarkable was not their existence. It was their accuracy. One report warned against a risky investment that later failed exactly as predicted. Another recommended a strategic acquisition that eventually generated hundreds of millions of dollars in profit. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Naomi had repeatedly identified opportunities and risks long before anyone else. Judge Lawson continued reading. The room remained completely silent except for the occasional turn of a page. Ethan's legal team appeared increasingly uncomfortable. They had built their entire argument around a simple claim. Naomi had not contributed meaningful work. Yet every new document made that claim harder to defend. Then the judge reached a memorandum dated nearly 8 years earlier. She paused and read it again. The document outlined a long-term growth strategy for Whitmore Capital. The proposal included expansion timelines, staffing forecasts, operational frameworks, and projected market positions extending almost a decade into the future. Much of what the company had become existed on those pages years before it happened. At the bottom sat a familiar signature. Naomi Brooks. Ethan felt a strange sensation settle over him. It was not anger. It was recognition. He remembered receiving that report. He remembered skimming through it during a flight to Los Angeles. He remembered being impressed by its depth. What he had forgotten was who wrote it. Success had buried so many memories beneath layers of meetings, interviews, and public appearances that entire chapters of his own story had faded. Now those chapters were returning one by one. Judge Lawson finally looked up from the folder. Her eyes moved from the documents to Naomi, then toward Ethan. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The evidence was beginning to tell a story more powerful than any testimony. And as the judge reached the final section of the folder, she discovered something unexpected. Tucked between the reports was a handwritten letter addressed to Ethan himself. It had never been mailed. It had never been shown publicly. And judging by the date at the top of the page, it had been written just weeks before everything began to fall apart. Judge Lawson carefully unfolded the handwritten letter. Unlike the corporate reports and financial analyses that filled the courtroom, this page carried something far more personal. The ink was slightly faded. The edges showed signs of age. Naomi lowered her eyes as the judge began reading. Silently, she had not expected the letter to appear. In truth, she had forgotten it existed. Years earlier, she had written it during one of the loneliest nights of her marriage. Ethan had been traveling constantly. Board meetings filled every week. Investor conferences filled every month. Their home had become a place where schedules crossed paths rather than a place where two people shared a life. The letter was never meant to be evidence. It was never meant for a courtroom. It was simply the honest voice of a woman trying to save something she still loved. Judge Lawson continued reading. The room remained completely still. Then she slowly placed the page on the bench and looked toward Ethan. There was no accusation in her expression, only disappointment. Ethan's attorney shifted uneasily. Ethan himself looked pale. For the first time all day, He seemed less like a billionaire executive and more like an ordinary man confronting a painful memory. The judge asked permission to enter the letter into the official record. No one objected. Portions were read aloud. Naomi had written about the early years in Brooklyn. She described the tiny apartment, the long nights, the dreams they built together. She wrote about how proud she was of what they had accomplished. But she also wrote something else. She wrote that she no longer recognized the man she had once sat beside at that kitchen table. She wrote that success had given them everything except time, everything except presence, everything except each other. Ethan stared at the letter as though seeing it for the first time. Because in many ways, he was. Naomi never sent it. She had folded it away and chosen silence instead. She had hoped actions would speak where words failed. She had hoped the distance would eventually close. It never did. Another document was presented. Then another. Internal correspondence. Strategic recommendations. Leadership evaluations. The pattern remained unchanged. Naomi's influence appeared everywhere. Not occasionally. Not symbolically. Everywhere. Entire divisions had been built using systems she designed. Major expansions followed frameworks she created years earlier. Even current executive procedures traced directly back to her work. Judge Lawson reviewed the growing mountain of evidence and slowly removed her glasses. Across the courtroom, reporters no longer looked surprised. The narrative had shifted completely. What began as a claim that Naomi contributed nothing was collapsing beneath the weight of documented reality. Then Naomi's attorney requested permission to introduce one final set of records from a storage archive recently recovered from company headquarters. Several sealed boxes were wheeled toward the front of the courtroom. Ethan immediately recognized them. And the moment he did, a look of genuine alarm crossed his face. The sealed archive boxes looked ordinary, but everyone in the courtroom could feel their significance. They had spent years in a secured storage room beneath Whitmore Capital's headquarters, untouched and largely forgotten. Ethan knew exactly what they contained. More importantly, he knew who had organized them. Naomi. Long before cloud databases became standard practice inside the company, Naomi insisted on preserving physical records of major decisions, strategic reviews, and executive planning sessions. At the time, many executives considered the process unnecessary. Naomi disagreed. She believed institutional memory mattered. Now that decision was about to change everything. Court staff carefully opened the first box. Inside were hundreds of documents arranged with remarkable precision. Color-coded tabs divided sections by year, department, and project. Judge Lawson examined the organization with visible interest. Every detail reflected the work of someone methodical, disciplined, and deeply involved in the company's operations. One by one, documents emerged. Board recommendations, strategic forecasts, risk assessments, expansion models, executive evaluations. Each file added another piece to a growing picture. The signatures alone told a story. Naomi's name appeared repeatedly across nearly every major milestone in company history. But now the evidence extended far beyond signatures. The documents revealed authorship, analysis, leadership, vision. Entire initiatives originated from Naomi's recommendations. Ethan sat motionless as memories returned. He remembered countless evenings when Naomi stayed at the office long after everyone else left. He remembered arriving the next morning to find completed reports waiting on his desk. He remembered trusting her judgment more than anyone else's. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped remembering those details. Success had replaced memory with mythology. The myth said he built everything himself. The records told a different story. Judge Lawson continued reviewing the archive. Then she reached a collection of executive meeting transcripts. The courtroom listened as excerpts were read aloud. Again and again, Naomi identified market opportunities years before competitors recognized them. Again and again, she proposed solutions that later became company policy. Again and again, senior leaders praised her contributions during private meetings. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Privately, everyone knew her value. Publicly, her role disappeared. Several reporters exchanged stunned looks. Some had written profiles celebrating Ethan's achievements for years. None had ever heard Naomi's name mentioned at this level. Across the aisle, Ethan's attorneys appeared increasingly resigned. The argument they brought into court no longer seemed sustainable. Then Judge Lawson opened the final folder from the first archive box. Inside was a document bearing signatures from every original executive involved in the company's earliest years. At the top was a title written in bold letters: Founding Leadership Contributions. Judge Lawson read the first paragraph. Her eyes widened slightly. Then she turned toward Ethan with an expression that suggested the next few minutes might become the most important of the entire trial. Judge Lawson held the document in silence for several moments before speaking. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Rain still drifted against the windows high above Manhattan, but inside the room every sound had faded into the background. The title alone carried extraordinary weight: Founding Leadership Contributions. The report had been prepared during Whitmore Capital's third year of operation and signed by every senior executive involved in building the company. Judge Lawson began reading selected portions into the record. The language was direct, professional, unambiguous. Naomi Brooks was identified as the architect of multiple operational systems that remained active within the company. She was credited with designing the firm's early risk management framework. She was recognized for creating expansion strategies that enabled national growth. Several executives described her as one of the most influential decision-makers in the organization's history. No one in the courtroom moved. Ethan stared at the document as though it belonged to someone else's life. Years earlier, he had personally approved the report. At the time, acknowledging Naomi's contributions felt natural because the truth was obvious. Everyone inside the company knew her value. Nobody questioned it. Somehow, over the years, that truth had been buried beneath public narratives, media appearances, and endless repetition. The judge continued reading. One statement came from the company's first chief financial officer. He wrote that without Naomi's strategic planning, Whitmore Capital would likely have failed during its first major expansion. Another executive credited her leadership with preventing multiple costly mistakes. Yet perhaps the most powerful section appeared near the end. It described Naomi not as a supporting spouse, but as a foundational builder whose influence could be traced through nearly every major success the company achieved. Judge Lawson slowly placed the document on the bench. Then she looked directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly, "earlier in these proceedings, your position was that Mrs. Whitmore never worked for the company." Ethan swallowed hard. For the first time all day, confidence abandoned him completely. The evidence surrounding him had become impossible to deny. Every exhibit, every signature, every report, every witness statement hidden within the archives pointed toward the same conclusion. The story he told the court no longer matched reality. Across the room, Naomi remained quiet. She did not look triumphant. She did not smile. There was no celebration in her expression, only a deep stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when someone no longer needs to prove who they are. Judge Lawson reviewed her notes and announced a brief recess before delivering her final ruling. The gallery erupted into whispers the moment she exited the bench. Reporters rushed to organize their stories. Attorneys exchanged urgent conversations. Yet Ethan remained seated, alone with memories he could no longer avoid. Meanwhile, Naomi stood near the window overlooking the rain-soaked city. After years of being invisible inside her own story, the truth had finally found its voice. And when the courtroom doors opened again 40 minutes later, everyone understood that the final chapter was about to begin. When Judge Lawson returned to the bench, the courtroom fell silent once more. The rain had stopped outside, and faint afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. It seemed fitting. For hours, the proceedings had uncovered layer after layer of truth hidden beneath years of assumptions, omissions, and forgotten records. Now only one thing remained: the ruling. Judge Lawson reviewed her notes before speaking. Her voice was calm, measured, and unmistakably firm. She explained that the evidence presented throughout the trial established a clear and consistent pattern. Naomi Brooks Whitmore had played a substantial and documented role in the creation, development, and long-term success of Whitmore Capital. The court recognized not only her contributions, but also the extraordinary extent of those contributions. Every major category of evidence supported the same conclusion: strategic planning, operational development, expansion initiatives, leadership decisions, institutional systems. Her influence was woven throughout the company's history. Ethan listened without moving. The words struck harder than any argument. Because they were true. Judge Lawson continued. She noted that the court had been presented with overwhelming documentation contradicting the claim that Naomi had not worked for the company. That claim, she stated, was unsupported by the facts. Around the room, reporters recorded every sentence. Attorneys remained silent. Naomi simply listened. She had waited years for acknowledgement, yet when it finally arrived, it felt quieter than she expected. Not victory, not revenge, just truth finding its proper place. The ruling concluded with a settlement reflecting Naomi's documented role in building the enterprise. Then Judge Lawson paused and looked toward both parties. Her final remarks had nothing to do with money. She spoke about partnership, about contribution, about the danger of allowing public narratives to replace reality. Success, she said, is rarely built by one person alone. Then she adjourned the court. Just like that, it was over. People began filing out of the room. Reporters rushed toward the hallway. Attorneys gathered their documents. The mountain of evidence that had filled the courtroom all day was packed away once more. Ethan remained seated for several moments after everyone else stood. His eyes drifted toward the exhibits, the signatures, the records, the forgotten chapters of his own life. For years he had believed the story the world told about him. Now he understood how much of that story belonged to someone else as well. Across the room, Naomi picked up her coat and quietly headed toward the exit. There were no speeches, no dramatic confrontation, no final accusation. She had no need for any of it. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Taxis rolled through the streets. Office workers hurried along crowded sidewalks. Life continued. Several months later, a new consulting firm opened in Midtown. Its office was modest compared to the empire Naomi helped build, but every system, every decision, and every vision belonged entirely to her. Above the entrance hung a simple sign bearing two words, Naomi Brooks. For the first time in her professional life, her name stood at the front of the story. And perhaps the most remarkable thing was this. The signatures had always been there. The world had simply chosen not to see them.